Immersive is the big buzzword of the contemporary theater scene, with Immersive Gatsby, Sleep No More, and of course, Immersive Phantom of the Opera. But we have to ask ourselves, how did the creators of these shows decide upon the immersive aspects? And how do they function properly? And do they have a contingency plan if everything falls apart? I'm Cash the Composer, and I'm chronicling the process of writing a new musical on this channel. Be sure to subscribe if you're interested in writing, in theater in general, or otherwise just want to listen to an artist ramble every now and again. Today we're going to talk about immersive theater, as I mentioned, but specifically how to implement immersive elements into a show, and how I did it in my debut show, what worked and what didn't, what I learned from that experience, and what I'm going to do in my next show. So let's start by talking about what immersive theater actually is. For the sake of today's discussion, I'm defining immersive theater as a structured narrative wherein the audience plays an active role. Like everything that is so nebulous, immersive theater is a spectrum. One end, the fourth wall, is perfectly intact, and on the other, it's straight up the real world. Within that spectrum, we can isolate 4 distinct milestones: engagement, assignment, problems, and impact. First, engagement. This is immersive light. The actors engage with the audience, which can be as simple as eye contact or as involved as sharing a dance or a drink. With this level of immersion, the audience is still a passive observer, but they are recognized by the characters. Maybe. They might be ignored if the moment calls for it in a moment of intimacy or self-reflection. Regardless, this is the easiest thing to do, but it is also the easiest to fail. More on that later. Second, we've got assignment. This is when you actually make the audience or specific audience members do specific things in aid of the story. This work has no actual impact on the story, only serving to fill out the whole of the setting. These sorts of things are very guided, with little room for improvisation on the part of the audience, and any leeway that is given is certainly not going to have any actual impact on the story. Third, we have problems. This is where we take assignments to the next level. We're not just giving them assignments. Those assignments can have multiple outcomes. Usually this is a binary: left or right or wrong, puzzles, choosing a story to follow, whatever. These problems require a solution by the audience member, and it is important to realize that these solutions do not actually impact the story, but rather the audience's perception of the story. Fourth and finally, we have impact. This is where we're snuggling up close to breaking down the suspension of disbelief entirely, as those problems actually have an impact on the story, affecting the narrative for better or for worse. You're not simply making choices that change how you experience the show. The actual show itself changes according to your whims. To better understand these 4 levels to immersive theater, let me provide specific examples from my own show, Fantasmagoriana. It's about the summer Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein. You can watch it on my Patreon if you're interested. Throughout the show, the audience is recognized as the invited guests of Lord Byron from the very first song, pulled into conversations, asked to dance, share a toast, and so on, demonstrating that first level of engagement. On the second level, assignment, we have various stories that are read and written throughout the show, which feature the audience members in roles as characters in these stories. Of course, the stories are already written, so they can't really affect the outcome. Next, we've got multiple instances throughout the show where the story actually splits into multiple areas, and the audience must decide which characters, which story they're going to follow. Finally, there's that final level of impact. And that was not realized in my show, actually. Unfortunately, you see, there's a moment in the story that Claire, the character that I played, actually speaks directly to the audience members, calling them out for their inaction. And even though the show was performed 5 times, not a single member of any of the audiences decided to actually do anything about their inaction. I crafted that moment so that the audience could stand up and try to change history, and they would have unlocked a secret. But I'll get into that later in this video. When it comes to actually using immersion in a show, you have to plan for everything. If you give the audience a screwdriver, well, there are 2 types of reactions. They're either going to stare at it and wonder if anyone's ever going to pick that up, or they're going to unscrew everything in sight. You have to plan for both eventualities and be able to smoothly progress the story regardless of whatever happens. First, we have to decide the level of immersion that the audience is going to have. In my first show, the entirety of the show takes place in Claire's mind as a flashback as she revisits the place where it all went down years later. She editorializes what actually happened, and the characters are caricatures of the actual people, and the drama is heightened according to her fading memory. If an audience member stood up and tried to change history, Claire would have broken down, realizing that it wasn't what actually happened, that there's no way to change what was, that no knight in shining armor can come to save her, despite what she wishes. The end point will always be the same, but the audience could have changed what happened in between because none of it was real. In my new show, working title 6 Miles, that is probably going to change down the line. It's also based on historical events, but unlike Fantasmagoriana, the audience isn't on equal playing field with the actors. The audience is a group of tourists, while the characters are ghosts acting out their history. So regardless of what the audience does, the characters are going to relive the same things the same way every time. So there's no level of impact that can happen that will change their story. But the tour guide is a different thing. But that's a whole other layer we'll address later. I promise I'm going to get to everything that I keep saying we'll get to that later. This might be a long video. Strap in. In Sleep No More, it was on that third level where the audience had choices to make in regards to their own perception of the story, but not to change the story itself. Similarly, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong because I haven't seen it yet, that Gatsby is also all about observation and not a lot of effect. So I think, given that that's the status quo for off-Broadway productions, that we can expect the same for Phantom. Though we do know that there are multiple shows a night, multiple casts, the audience will be guided, so it may be closer to the second level with minimal choice to affect your perception of the story. And honestly, that makes sense. It's the safe bet to keep the story intact, and that's important for two reasons. First, keeping the story intact maintains the integrity of the plot and the characters so that the actors don't have to worry about altering their work, and the creator's vision is realized completely at each performance. Second, and perhaps a little bit oddly, it makes things consistent for the sake of reviews. Both for the sake of the reviewer and the audience member. Reviewers want to see consistency in a show, otherwise two papers will have completely different shows that they're reviewing, and it's hard to gauge the actual merits of the show at its core. And of course, after reading a review, the audience wants to see the same show that the reviewer saw. It's unfortunate that the status quo is so set in stone that immersive theater is bound by these same constraints. Thankfully, I have no such boundaries given that I'm down in the south a couple hundred miles away from the Great White Way, so I can do whatever the hell I want. Yay! So for those of you who are new or perhaps need a refresher, because it has been a while, I do apologize. I'm writing a musical about the story of Lavinia Fisher. In the legend, she was a terrible serial killer, but in reality, she was a woman in love, wrongfully persecuted. For my musical, you're being guided on a ghost tour, being told the legend while the history plays out in front of you. There are only 3 actors planned. Lavinia, her husband, and the ghost tour guide. All of the other historical characters will be a part of the immersion, but the question is, how? Before we get into all of that, let's talk about my first show a little bit more so I can share a bit about the successes and failures of the immersion. I've done 2 productions now, a Halloween show that was one night only and a week-long run as a part of the Piccolo Spoleto Festival. I learned a lot from the Halloween show, and the Piccolo show was essentially perfect, except for the inaction of the audience. But let's get into detail. In the Halloween show, I had a lot of dancing. The idea was that the dancing would get the people out of their seats frequently, encouraging them to mill about the space. However, the space was vast, large, and there were a lot of chairs, so the audience acted like a traditional audience, except when they were dancing, which was incredibly frustrating. To mitigate this in the Piccolo show, I had a much smaller, more intimate space, a smaller audience, fewer chairs, and only one dance, which was more of a social time for the actors to interact directly with the audience members to pull them into the show and make them comfortable existing in the space. As a result, the audience didn't feel nearly as glued to their seats. They were able to move around much more freely, leading to the next failure of the Halloween show. In the Halloween show, I had moments where the show split in two, specifically a moment where there were two dialogues happening at once, one at the front of the hall, the other moving around the space, and another moment where a song was happening inside while the action was happening outside. The audience stayed seated still for both of these, so the dialogues were both obscured for everyone, and no one saw what happened outside. I actually listened to the recording of my actors from that night, and the two actors are like, nobody's watching us. Should we still do the thing? And the other one goes, yeah, I mean, we're getting paid, so why not? Anyhow, so for Piccolo, I had windows. Actually, I had windows instead of walls on two of the walls of the room, so the audience could readily see when something was happening outside, and whenever I split the action, half was inside, half out. The first split was forced, where the men were sent outside and the women kept inside. Then everyone congregated together outside, demonstrating that, hey, this is a space you should go to if there's something happening you want to see. And it worked! Lastly, the stories. In the Halloween show, the audience wasn't convinced by the stories. A part of it was that they felt really stilted, especially the stories told by Percy and John, because the actors just weren't comfortable with them. For Piccolo, though, they found their footing and they felt a lot more secure, and as a result, their confidence rubbed off on the audience, and they had a lot more fun playing those roles. All that is to say, I learned several essential things. Number one, the space itself is vital to shape such that it will be conducive to the desired actions of the audience. Number two, expectations need to be established as early as possible, especially when it comes to elements of choice. And number three, when an audience member has to play a role, the actors need to be totally secure in their own roles. All of these are vital for the success of my show, or any show really. So the audience will be participating in a ghost tour, and they will not be able to affect the history happening with the ghosts. However, I need somewhere for those other historical characters to be played. I have three options, so let's look at them. First, I could do exactly what I did with Fantasmagoriana and assign particular characters to the audience members, either by offering assigned tickets ahead of time or by having the actors address an individual as that character and hope they go along with it. Now, with Fantasmagoriana, this worked really well because they could easily say no to playing a character in a story, but as they were being asked by the author. Here, though, the ghosts would be 100% convinced that the individual they're speaking to is in fact the character they think they're seeing. So if the audience member isn't into it, things won't go well. There are ways around it, but the complexity of it is somewhat daunting. The second option is a bit of a cop-out, and that is having the tour guide act as all of the characters in the story. That removes the element of immersion from the show, but it also lends a sense of consistency to the show, which I said is super duper important. Unfortunately, it would also make the tour guide's role much less free and fun, forcing them to follow specific paths every time, and I want that role to be open to change. Additionally, it would introduce an element of confusion. Wearing that many hats could very quickly get confusing for an audience member trying to keep track of the action, unless I literally had the tour guide wearing that many hats, i.e. donning costumes. But again, that's getting a bit complicated. I think I'm going to go with option 3, which I realized in the middle of rehearsals for Fantasmagoriana. In many rehearsals, we had test audience members to work with, but for most of our rehearsals, I referred to the invisible audience member. And I think that's what I have to do here. The ghosts address empty space as though there were people there. No, I know what you're thinking. Won't that be even more confusing than if there was one person playing all the roles? And doesn't that also remove the element of immersion? And I hear you. I do, but hear me out. Think about those 3 things I learned. Shape the space, establish expectations, and be sure that the actors are secure. I will shape the space to make it very clear when there's an empty void. An altar for a priest to stand behind, a rope that needs a second pair of hands to pull, and other very, very obvious tells that there's something missing, and that something missing is a person. I may very well include costume pieces, a cassock, a prisoner's uniform, what have you, that the audience members can don if they so choose. That's right, the idea is if an audience member wants to, they can step into the characters. And to establish that expectation, I'm going to have the tour guide make two of the audience members pretend to be Lavinia and John to act out the start of the legend. They will point out the empty space and the costumes and ask the two audience members to volunteer. I'm sure there are other things I can do to establish that expectation, like a note in the program, and I will be sure to do those things, whatever I can think of. However, I will try to make things as obvious as possible and be wary of the fact that people do not tend to have good reading comprehension skills in a dark theatrical space. Finally, the ghosts will never change anything they do. Regardless of what happens with the audience, the ghosts will always step the same steps, say the same words, and end the same end. They will be infinitely secure in their roles. Now, think about how you talk to your mom versus how you talk to your best friend versus how you talk to your partner versus how do you talk to a priest. The way you stand, the way you speak, the way you think, it all changes depending on who's in the room. So that relies about 30% on the actors and 70% on me as the writer to be aware of how they would speak to the different people in their lives. If the audience observes those distinct changes, they will be able to understand when they're talking to someone new, especially if I make sure to use names and frequently. I think, observing the things I learned from my trial and error of Fantasmagoriana, I'll be able to make the invisible character thing work. So if I have a timid audience, it'll all be invisible, but if I have a brave audience, I'll have a lot of people stepping into all the characters. Now, I hear you. How will they know their lines? I have a few thoughts on this. First, I could give them their lines. Have a Bible, but it opens up to a specific page and there's a script in there rather than an actual Bible for the priest. This introduces a third element aside from the space and the costume, but would it be worth it? Second, I could just not give them lines and have those characters be mute, where everything is said by Lavinia and John instead. But that kind of feels crappy, and as hesitant as people are to speak, they're even more hesitant to move. Third, and this is the most fun option, I could just not give them their lines and force them to improvise. Listen, a lot of people are really timid, but when it comes down to it, people will surprise you. And no matter what they say, the ghosts will respond the same way. So they have to guess and try to figure out their role in the story. I said fun, I meant fun for me to watch. Honestly, I'm not really sure which of those options would be best, but I'm leaning towards not choosing. Writing up lines, especially so that the actors for the ghosts have an idea of what they're hearing and responding to, and hiding them in a Bible or whatever, but letting the audience members decide if they're going to pick it up, stay mute, or try to make up their own lines in response. That way, it isn't rigid and I still get to have my fun. Now, I mentioned before that the tour guide is another layer entirely. I've decided on how I'm writing their role. They will have chunks that are scripted telling the story, and the rest, improv. This means that the actor in that role can adapt each performance to the needs of the given audience, more or less hands-on, matching their energy, etc. I want to get someone in that role who really connects with an audience, so I'll be looking at folks who are frequent flyers in the realm of immersion. Drag queens top the list. Anyways, on a final note, I want you to look at the runtime for this video. This is just talking about the theory behind immersion, planning it all out, and I'm barely scratching the surface, y'all. Imagine the amount of time it takes to actually implement this and to do it well. That's why the price tag for Immersive Phantom is like $250. It's necessary given the amount of painstaking work that goes into this, and yet people perceive a show without a fourth wall as casual, and therefore frequently demand a lower price tag than a traditional show, which is certainly disheartening to say the least, and frankly, insulting. So, with that in mind, please, I beg you, consider the effort that goes into unconventional art before you complain about the cost. $250 is about 35 hours of minimum wage work, which might seem like a lot, but 35 hours is about the length of time of 4.5 rehearsals. And most Broadway shows rehearse for 4 to 6 weeks, 6 days a week, and the actors cost a heck of a lot more than minimum wage, given the amount of time it takes for them to hone their craft. And that's not even considering the time it took to write the musical and bring it to stage. For Phantom, that would be, what, like 2 years? And the time it takes to make it immersive, well, we've been waiting for Immersive Phantom for over 2 years, so that's almost 5 years to create the show. How many hours do you think, how many people do you think in those 5 years were involved in its creation? And renting the space, making the costumes, liability insurance, God knows what else. Just something to think about. That's all for today, guys. If you enjoyed this, please go ahead and subscribe, ring the little bell to be notified next week when I post another video about the physiology of writing lyrics, considering vowels, consonants, and of course, rhymes. If you want to see that video early, check out my Patreon, where I post regular updates about my work and these videos as soon as they're edited. Till next time, bye y'all.